Hello, this is Digestive System video number 9, the final digestive system video. In this video, we're going to be covering the last segment of the alimentary canal, the large intestine. Some fun facts about the large intestine. So, comparing it to the small intestine, large intestine is larger in diameter, but shorter in length. It's about 5 feet long in most adults, the average adult. It extends from the cecum, that's the beginning segment of it, to the anus. The main functions of the large intestine are absorption, and mainly there's a huge amount of water absorption, but also electrolytes and some vitamins as well. As in all segments of the alimentary canal, there's motility, so propulsion of the contents is also a function. And finally, the third main function is elimination of the feces, which is accumulation of undigestible matter, as well as other things that get mixed in along the pathway through the alimentary canal. The large intestine can be divided into 5 segments. So it starts with the cecum, and the cecum receives chyme from the ileum at the ileocecal valve. The appendix is a small branch off of the cecum. Cecum leads into the colon, and that's the longest segment. The colon ends up into the dumping material into the rectum. That leads to the anal canal, and then through the anus to the exterior. Now, the colon can be further subdivided into different segments, and that starts with the ascending colon. And in the ascending colon, material moves up the right side of the abdominal cavity. Transverse colon, and that moves material from the right to the left side. Descending colon, in which material is moving down along the left side, and sigmoid or S-shaped colon. So this slide is showing some of the features in terms of the anatomy. Here's the cecum. The ileocecal valve is not at the very bottom of the cecum, it's part way up. So material entering is going to fall into this pouch, and that pouch is called the cecum. Okay. The appendix, or the vermiform appendix, vermiform means worm-shaped, is a small, very small branch off the base of the cecum. Okay. Cecum then leads into the colon. Here's the ascending colon. Takes a turn, and transverse colon. Takes another turn, descending colon. And here's the S-shaped or sigmoid colon. And then there's an expansion, which is called the rectum. And then the last segment is the anal canal. That leads to the anus. Some other features I want to point out in terms of the anatomy. Where the colon takes a turn between ascending and transverse, that's called the right colic flexure. Flexure means bend point. Where it takes a turn on the other side, transverse to descending colon, that's the left colic flexure. If you look at the colon, it has these repeating pattern of bulging kind of segments. And those are called haustra, singular haustrum. And running along the surface of the colon on 2 sides, we're seeing one here, there would be another one on the other side, is a structure called the tenei coli. The tenei coli is due to the longitudinal layer of the muscularis. It's not continuous around the entire tube. It's confined to these 2 segments. And so it sort of produces this bunching, and therefore the haustra. Running along the surface of the colon are these occasional adipose tissue accumulations. Those are called the omental appendices. For the ascending colon and the descending colon and the rectum, those three are all located retroperitoneal. Okay, the cecum is not, ascending colon is. So that's within the back body wall. Then it emerges to form the transverse colon. And that's intraperitoneal. And in fact is attached to the body wall by a mesentery called the transverse mesocolon. Okay, then the descending colon goes back behind the body wall in the dorsal body wall. That's retroperitoneal. And the sigmoid colon is not. It's also attached to a mesentery than the rectum is. Okay, so different segments are retroperitoneal. Okay, let's move on to the next slide. A couple of interesting top mentions here. So these are basically descriptions of what I just mentioned from the previous slide. Tenei coli, longitudinal smooth muscle, the longitudinal layer of the muscularis is restricted to just thin bands along the surface of the colon. And the mental appendices as well. All right, as far as the microscopic anatomy of the large intestine, so if we look at the mucosal layer, it's a simple columnar epithelium, so this is similar to the small intestine. And that's true everywhere except for the anal canal. In the anal canal, there's a lot of friction due to movement of the feces, and so it's a stratified squamous epithelium there. The wall of the large intestine has, like in the small intestine, deep crypts or glands. These are the intestinal crypts or intestinal glands. The text calls them glands. And these are also secreting substances, not as many as you find in the gastric glands or even the small intestinal glands. In the large intestine, these glands have a huge number of goblet cells. And so mainly what's being secreted here is a lot of mucus. If you think about it, the material that's moving through the feces is being compacted, water is being absorbed, and it's leaving solid material behind, and that's being compacted. And the more that gets compacted, there's more, the more irritation, I guess you could say, or the more, rubbing of that material against the wall as it passes through. Another feature of the mucosal layer of the large intestine is, unlike the small intestine, there are no villi or microvilli. So this slide is showing mucosal layer, mucosal epithelium here, simple columnar epithelium. It's on the surface, and there's an opening into the intestinal glands or crypts, and abundant goblet cells there. And as far as the other tissues, pretty similar to the small intestine. So there's a lamina propria rich with blood vessels, and thin muscularis mucosae layer, submucosal layer here. The muscularis externa is modified. There is a complete circular layer that runs all the way around the tube, but the longitudinal layer is restricted to this band, and that's the Tenei coli that I mentioned before. All right, this is a histological slide, microscopic slide showing the mucosal epithelium of the large intestine and the intestinal crypts. And all of these cells that have this kind of whitish interior here, those are goblet cells, and you can see there's a huge number of goblet cells lining the intestinal crypts. So there's a lot of mucus that's being produced, and that mucus is helping to lubricate passage of feces through the large intestine. Now, one feature of the large intestine, the colon especially, is there's a resident population of bacteria there. It's called the bacterial flora. And these bacteria have arrived there either by passing through the upper digestive tract and colonizing the colon that way, or some may have entered by the anus. So this is generally referred to as the microbiome. What do these bacterial populations do? There's a number of functions that have been known for a long time, and those are they are involved in fermenting some kinds of carbohydrates that we can't digest otherwise. So they do help with digesting those. Some bacterial species do produce irritating acids and gases that can be particularly odorous, sulfur gases, for example. Some of them are capable of making certain vitamins, B complex and vitamin K, and we would absorb those through the wall of the large intestine. In addition to those, there's a number of functions that have only recently become known and are very active areas of areas of study now, including behavior and susceptibility to certain diseases. So that's an area that probably will explode in the near future. How does material move through the colon? So there are different ways that it can move. The tube, the colon and large intestine in general being a larger diameter tube, peristalsis is not as effective as it is in the small intestine. So there is weak peristalsis, but that's really not the main driver in terms of motility. The main drivers are what are called haustral churning and mass movements. In haustral churning, when a haustrum, one of those compartments, gets filled, that stimulates contraction of the circular layer of the muscularis. That churns the contents, and it ends up eventually pushing the contents onto the next haustrum. The other type of motility is what's called mass movements, and this is a very powerful type of motility. Mass movement happens basically in response to filling of the stomach. When the stomach fills and stretches, that stimulates a contraction beginning in the middle of the transverse colon. And this pushes material, the feces, forward into the descending colon, sigmoid colon, and the rectum. So those are called mass movements. All right, let's talk about the rectum. When the rectum fills, then that triggers an expansion of the wall of the rectum. And there are sensory neurons that detect this stretch. And that starts a reflex called the defecation reflex. Now, the defecation reflex involves the anal sphincter. The anal sphincter is the last sphincter in the alimentary canal. So, like other sphincters, that's controlling movement of material on, in this case, release of feces during defecation. So, when the anal sphincter opens, defecation occurs. But this sphincter is a little bit different from the other sphincters. Other sphincters are entirely made up of smooth muscle and are controlled involuntarily. The anal sphincter actually has two sphincters within it. One is a smooth muscle sphincter, which is controlled involuntarily. And that's what's controlled through the defecation reflex. The other sphincter, the external anal sphincter, is made up of skeletal muscle, and that's controlled voluntarily. So the anal sphincter can open involuntarily due to the defecation reflex, but we control voluntarily when to open the external sphincter when it's convenient to defecate. So the slide is showing the anal sphincter. Here, these muscles are the internal anal sphincter, smooth muscle. They're controlled involuntarily, and they're surrounded by skeletal muscle in the external anal sphincter. Okay, when feces accumulate in the rectum, the wall of the rectum will stretch, and a sensory neuron there will send a signal. And this is shown in this slide, the defecation reflex. So what's shown on the left here is the reflex. This is all involuntary. This is involving the autonomic nervous system. Here's a sensory neuron detecting the stretch. They're called stretch baroreceptors. When feces accumulate, those are activated. They send a signal to the spinal cord, and that reflex will send out a motor impulse. The motor neurons are going to do two things. One is causing the wall of the rectum to contract, and that's going to help to force feces out. The other is causing the internal sphincter to relax, allowing feces to move into the anal canal. Okay, so now they've moved into the anal canal, but the anus is still closed, and that's because the external sphincter, not really illustrated well on this slide, but the external sphincter is still contracted and closing the pathway. So the external sphincter is controlled by motor neurons that we control voluntarily. And when we relax the external sphincter, defecation occurs. Final slide is a common disorder of the large intestine, which is appendicitis, which is inflammation of the appendix. Most cases of appendicitis are due to accumulation of fecal matter within the appendix. And the appendix is a very narrow tube, dead-end tube. So accumulation can cause the appendix to swell, and that could shut off the blood supply. That results in abundant bacterial growth and pain associated with that. The pain is typically localized to the lower right quadrant, which is the location of the appendix. Now, the real problem with appendicitis is if you feel that pain, you should get attention right away, because delay could cause rupture of the appendix. And if that occurs, then the abundant bacterial population in the large intestine will spread throughout the peritoneal cavity. And that's a dangerous situation. So if that occurs, and other signs are of progressing appendicitis is nausea or vomiting, tenderness in the abdominal, especially the lower right abdominal region, fever, and lower right pain. So appendicitis that's progressing is treated by removal of the appendix, appendectomy. Here is shown in the slide an inflamed appendix after surgical removal. All right, that's the end of this video and the end of the material for the digestive system. See ya.